Welcome to our channel. Today we delve into a structure that has been condemned by international bodies, painted with graffiti of hatred, and labeled with the most inflammatory words in the political lexicon. It is a story of concrete and wire, but more importantly, it is a story of a nation's survival in the cold, hard data hidden within the vaults of the Israel State Archives. We will examine whether the barrier built in the early 2000s is truly a tool of segregation or a desperate intellectual response to a wave of unprecedented violence. We will look past the slogans to find the blueprints, the cabinet minutes, and the lives that were saved by a fence that the world chose to call a wall. So, let us begin. The spring of 2002 did not smell of blossoms in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It smelled of burnt rubber, acrid smoke, and the metallic tang of blood on pavement. In the Israel State Archives, under the classification of the Prime Minister's Office and the Ministry of Defense, there are folders that remain partially redacted, yet their contents tell a story of a government pushed to the absolute brink. The Second Intifada had transformed the daily commute into a game of Russian roulette. Every bus was a potential coffin, and every cafe was a target for a young man or woman carrying a backpack filled with nails, ball bearings, and high explosives. By March of that year, the casualty count had reached a level that no democratic state could reasonably sustain without a total collapse of the social fabric. The documents from the security cabinet meetings during this period reflect a sense of controlled desperation. The ministers were looking at maps of the Green Line, the old armistice border from 1949, realizing that it was nothing more than a ghost, a line on paper that offered zero resistance to those seeking to enter Israeli population centers with the intent to kill. On the night of March 27, 2002, the tension snapped. The Park Hotel in Netanya was filled with elderly citizens and families celebrating the Passover Seder. They were singing songs of freedom from Egyptian bondage when a suicide bomber from the Hamas organization walked into the crowded dining room. The explosion killed 30 people and injured over 140. The archival photographs from the scene show the white tablecloths soaked in red, the broken matzah scattered among the glass shards. This was the catalyst. This was the moment when the intellectual debate over the seam zone ended, and the physical construction of a barrier became an existential necessity. The Israeli public, regardless of political affiliation, demanded a shield. In a small, dimly lit office within the Ministry of Defense, a man we shall call David, a senior civil engineer who had spent his life building bridges and roads, found himself staring at a different kind of project. He wasn't tasked with connecting people. He was tasked with separating them for the sake of their lives. His desk was piled with topographical maps of the Judean hills and the Samarian ridges. The records indicate that the primary concern was not political borders, but the quote, 2 and the quote, 3. David knew that the phrase, quote, 4 was already beginning to circulate in European newspapers, even before the first shovel hit the dirt. He looked at the designs on his drafting table and saw something very different from the monolith described in the headlines. The blueprints, specifically those filed under Project 72 Alpha, showed a complex system of chain-link mesh, electronic sensors, and trenches. It was a sophisticated, high-tech fence designed to detect movement, not a medieval wall designed to imprison. The archives of the June 23rd cabinet session in 2002 reveal the intense debate over the route. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, known for his military pragmatism, sat across from legal advisors who warned of the international repercussions. The transcripts show that the Israeli leadership was acutely aware of the humanitarian cost. They discussed the, quote, five for the Palestinian residents, debating how to allow farmers access to their olive groves while preventing a suicide bomber from reaching a kindergarten in Kfar Saba. It was a logic of survival that the rest of the world viewed through a lens of abstraction. The documents show that the Israeli side was forced into this massive undertaking because the Palestinian Authority, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, had not only failed to stop the attacks, but was, according to intercepted intelligence documents like those found during Operation Defensive Shield, actively funding the infrastructure of the suicide cells. One of the most persistent myths, often repeated in the halls of the United Nations, is that Israel built a continuous concrete wall to divide the land. However, the technical specifications found in the engineering archives of the Israel Defense Forces tell a starkly different story. 97% of the entire barrier is a fence. It is a multi-layered obstacle consisting of a fine wire mesh that triggers an electronic alarm if touched, a ditch to prevent vehicle crossings, and a series of cameras. In most places, there isn't even a paved patrol road. It is a transparent barrier. The concrete sections, which make up a mere 3% of the total length, were only constructed in specific areas where the threat of sniper fire from nearby Palestinian buildings was a verified, daily reality for Israeli civilians. In places like the Trans-Israel Highway, known as Highway 6, the concrete slabs were a direct response to militants shooting at moving family cars from the heights of Qalqilia. Imagine a father driving his daughter to school along a road he has traveled for a decade. He knows exactly where the road curves near the seam line. Suddenly, a bullet shatters the windshield. He doesn't see the shooter. The shooter is hidden in a window 1,000 meters away. This happened so frequently in the early 2000s that the highway was becoming a graveyard. The archives of the Ministry of Transport recorded dozens of such incidents. The decision to place concrete slabs in those specific gaps was an act of engineering mercy. To call those 3% of protective slabs an quote, _6 is to ignore the physics of a sniper's bullet. The Israeli engineers were not building a monument to segregation. They were building a curtain of stone to catch the lead intended for children's heads. The logistics of the project were staggering. In the Israel State Archives, there are files detailing the purchase of thousands of kilometers of specialized wire from manufacturers who were often hesitant to sell to Israel due to political pressure. The intelligence services, the Shin Bet, had to provide daily updates on the shifting threat maps to ensure the fence's route would actually be effective. The reports from late 2003 show a dramatic shift in the data. In the areas where the fence had been completed, the number of successful infiltrations dropped by over 90%. The quote, _8 nature of the barrier meant that the Israel Defense Forces could respond to a breach in minutes, often catching the attackers before they could reach a highway or a town. Yet the narrative in the global media remained fixed. The images broadcast to the world were almost exclusively of the concrete sections in Jerusalem or Bethlehem, creating the illusion of a 1,000-mile wall. The documents from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time show a desperate effort to provide journalists with tours of the 97% that was just wire mesh. The journalists, however, found the wire mesh __quote_9__. They wanted the gray slabs. They wanted the symbolism of the Berlin Wall, even if the context was entirely different. The Israeli government was fighting a two-front war, one against the suicide bombers of Hamas and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, and another against a global propaganda machine that refused to look at the blueprints. Behind the scenes, the legal battles within Israel were just as fierce. The Supreme Court of Israel, led by Chief Justice Aharon Barak, became a theater of democratic accountability. The court archives contain hundreds of petitions filed by Palestinian residents, often supported by Israeli human rights organizations. In a landmark ruling in June 2004 regarding the village of Beit Sarik, the court demonstrated the intellectual defense that characterizes the Jewish state. Justice Barak wrote that the path of the law is not the path of the sword. He ordered the government to move the route of the fence in several areas, even at the cost of reduced security, to ensure that the humanitarian impact on the local Palestinian population was minimized. This internal self-correction is rarely mentioned in the apartheid narrative. A state that was truly committed to apartheid would never allow its own Supreme Court to dismantle its security infrastructure for the sake of the rights of the other. The archives show that the Ministry of Defense had to rewrite hundreds of miles of plans, move tens of thousands of tons of materials, and spend millions of additional shekels to comply with the court's demands for proportionality. The fence was a living, breathing legal document, constantly being adjusted to balance the right to life with the right to property. It was a manifestation of a nation that refused to lose its soul even while fighting for its body. In the offices of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, the document seized by the Israel Defense Forces during various operations painted a darker picture. Ledgers showed payments made to the families of __quote_14__, the very individuals the fence was designed to stop. The funding for these attacks often originated from international aid that had been diverted into the _15_, the Al-Aqsa Fund. The Israeli intelligence reports from 2003 and 2004 track the flow of these funds with meticulous detail. They saw the money moving from bank accounts in Europe and the Gulf to the local commanders of terrorist cells. To the Israeli leadership, the fence was not just a physical barrier. It was a countermeasure to a state-sponsored industry of death. The personal stories of those on the front lines provide the most visceral evidence. Consider the testimony of a reserve officer named Avi, who served in the _16 in 2004. His unit's job was to patrol the newly finished sections of the fence near the town of Tulkarm. He described the fence not as a wall of hate, but as a pressure release valve. Before the fence, his soldiers were constantly in the heart of Palestinian villages, engaged in high-tension raids to catch suspects. After the fence was built, the friction decreased. The soldiers were on the line, and the infiltrators were kept at bay by technology rather than bullets. Avi recalled a night when the sensors alerted them to a cut in the wire. They arrived to find a young man who had been told by his handlers that there was no way through. He had surrendered as soon as the spotlights hit him. In his bag, they found a suicide vest packed with TNT and ball bearings. That young man survived the night because of the fence, and so did the dozens of Israelis he would have killed in a Netanya mall. The intelligence community's records from the mid-2000s highlight the intellectual superiority of the barrier. It wasn't just about the physical fence. It was about the data it generated. Every touch on the wire, every movement captured by the thermal cameras was fed into a central command and control system. This allowed the Israel Defense Forces to be surgical. Instead of a blanket curfew on an entire region, they could target the specific 5-meter section where a breach was attempted. This was the quote, 20 in action, using sensors and algorithms to protect a democracy while minimizing the footprint of the military. It was a sophisticated, multi-dimensional shield that the world simplified into a one-dimensional quote, 21 By 2005, the results were undeniable. The statistics from the Ministry of Internal Security showed a 70% drop in the number of successful suicide bombings in the regions where the barrier had been completed. The fear that had paralyzed the nation began to lift. Children went back to schools without armored guards at every gate. The economy, which had been in a tailspin, began to recover. The quote, 22 label grew louder in the universities of London and New York, but in the streets of Haifa and Ashdod, the fence was known by another name, the Lifeline. The archival records also show the quiet cooperation that often went unrecorded. Despite the public rhetoric, there were many instances where Palestinian local leaders worked with the Israeli civil administration to adjust the fence's route to protect local infrastructure. These meetings, held in dusty trailers at the border, were the true reality of the conflict. Men with maps trying to solve practical problems. The documents show that when logic was applied, solutions were found. Agricultural gates were built, and hundreds of permits were issued daily for workers to cross through regulated terminals. It was a system designed to be permeable for the peaceful and impenetrable for the violent. Yet there was always the shadow of the 3%. Those towering concrete slabs in Jerusalem became the focal point for every activist's camera. They were covered in colorful murals of peace doves and angry slogans, hiding the fact that just behind them sat neighborhoods like Gilo or Ramat, which had been subjected to years of shooting from the hills of Beit Jala. The archives of the Jerusalem municipality from the late 90s and early 2000s are filled with reports of bullets entering the bedrooms of infants. The concrete wasn't there to make a statement. It was there to act as a shield against a specific, lethal trajectory. If the snipers hadn't fired, the concrete would never have been poured. This is the fundamental truth that the apartheid narrative conveniently forgets. Every inch of the barrier was a response to an act of violence. As the construction continued, the cost rose into the billions. The Finance Ministry archives reflect the heavy burden this project placed on the national budget. It was an investment in non-violence, a way to stop the killing without having to engage in a full-scale war every month. The intellect of the fence lay in its ability to provide a non-lethal solution to a lethal problem. By creating a physical distance, it reduced the need for the iron fist that the critics of Israel were so quick to condemn. However, as the physical barrier went up, the psychological barrier between the two peoples seemed to solidify in the eyes of the international community. The documents from the early years of the barrier's existence also hint at something more mysterious. There are reports of anomalies found near the fence, strange markings and buried items that didn't fit the profile of a standard terrorist attempt. Some intelligence officers whispered that the fence was being used as a backdrop for something else, a different kind of signaling between the two sides that went beyond bombs and wire. There were stories of high-level messages being passed through the agricultural gates, of secret understandings that the fence made possible by stabilizing the chaotic border. It seemed that the very thing meant to divide was in some strange, shadow-filled way creating a new, albeit cold, framework for communication. The first phase of the barrier's history ends with a nation finally catching its breath after years of mourning. The suicide bombings had not vanished, but they had been contained. The Apartheid Wall myth had taken root in the soil of international public opinion, but for the people living behind the wire, the reality was much simpler. They were still alive. The archives show a government that had achieved its primary goal, yet was bracing for a new kind of war, a war of words and images where the truth was often the first casualty. In the corridors of power in Jerusalem, there was a growing realization that while they had built a shield of steel and concrete, they had yet to find a way to defend against the poison of a false narrative. As the sun set over the Mediterranean in 2005, the fence stretched across the landscape like a long silver scar. To the engineers who built it, it was a masterpiece of security. To the families who no longer feared the sound of a bus exploding, it was a miracle. But to those who watched from afar, it was a symbol of an intractable conflict. The documents of that era suggest that even then, some knew the fence was only a temporary fix for a much deeper wound. There were rumors of a Phase 2, a project so secret that its name was never written in the public cabinet minutes, a project that would take the concept of the fence to a level the world could not even imagine. The truth of those rumors was buried deep within the secure servers of the Kyria, waiting for a time when the world was ready to listen to the logic of the survivor. The barrier was standing, the lives were saved, but the silence from the other side of the wire was growing louder. In the shadow of the concrete slabs, a new generation was being raised on both sides, one that had never known a world without the fence. The archives of the future were already being written in the dust of the construction sites. It was said that a certain high-ranking official, upon seeing the final map of the first phase, remarked to his aide that the fence was not the end of the story, but merely the prologue to a much more dangerous game of chess. A game where the board was made of stone, and the pieces were the souls of two nations. The records of the Israel State Archives for the year 2005 close with a sense of ominous accomplishment. The barrier worked. The blood in the streets had dried. But the documents also contain a warning, a whispered concern that the apartheid label would eventually become a weapon more powerful than any suicide vest. The truth was there, in the percentages and the blueprints, but the world was already looking away, distracted by the next headline. And in the darkness of the borderlands, something else was beginning to stir. Something that no amount of wire or concrete could ever truly keep out. It was the realization that the wall, as thin and as mesh-like as it was, had a weight that no one had truly calculated yet. There were reports of a meeting that never officially happened between a man from the Prime Minister's office and a shadow from the other side, held at a gate that didn't appear on any public map. They spoke of things that the documents could not capture, and as the man from Jerusalem walked back to his car, he realized that the most insurmountable wall was not made of concrete at all. The realization that the most insurmountable wall was not made of concrete but of perception remained a heavy burden for the architects of Israel's security. As the first decade of the new millennium progressed, the physical barrier evolved into something far more complex than a simple fence or a series of concrete slabs. It became an integrated, living system of intelligence and technology that defined the boundaries of a nation determined to protect its future without sacrificing its values. The blueprints changed, the sensors grew more sensitive, and the documents in the Israel State Archives began to reflect a shift from brute force to refined intellectual defense. In the sterile, climate-controlled rooms of the Ministry of Defense's __quote _30 directorate, a different kind of war was being waged. It was a war of data points and logistical precision. Files from 2006, specifically under the designation __quote _31 detail the transition of the barrier from a static obstacle to a dynamic gateway. A man named Eliyahu, a systems architect who had spent years in the high-tech sector of Herzliya before being called to this project, found himself designing terminals that resembled international airports more than military checkpoints. He spent his days looking at the flow of human traffic, calculating the exact seconds needed for a biometric scan to confirm a permit. The archives describe these terminals, such as the one at Kalandia or the Sha'ar Ephraim crossing, as the lungs of the barrier. Through these gates, tens of thousands of Palestinian laborers passed every morning, seeking work in Israeli construction and agriculture. The documents show that the Israeli government invested hundreds of millions of shekels into making these crossings as non-intrusive as possible. The goal was to create a frictionless experience for the peaceful majority while maintaining an ironclad filter against the radical minority. The reports from the civil administration during this period highlight the Fabric of Life initiatives, showing that even at the height of security tensions, the economic ties between the two populations were preserved by the very structure the world called a wall. The apartheid narrative, however, was deaf to the hum of the biometric scanners. In the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are folders labeled International Legal Challenges 2007. They contain transcripts of sessions at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The Israeli legal teams presented evidence of the barrier's effectiveness, citing the dramatic drop in suicide attacks. They brought forward the technical data showing that the vast majority of the barrier remained a simple wire fence. But the records show a profound disconnect. The world was focused on the aesthetics of the concrete, while Israel was focused on the statistics of survival. One particular document, a redacted intelligence summary from the Shin Bet in late 2008, tells the story of a, quote, 38 that never made the evening news. A cell of extremists had planned to exploit a small gap in the fence near the southern Hebron Hills, an area where the terrain made construction difficult. The sensors, a sophisticated web of seismic and infrared technology, detected the vibration of a single shovel hitting the earth. Within 4 minutes, a specialized unit was on the scene. They found a tunnel, not a grand passage, but a narrow, desperate crawl space intended to bypass the quote 39 wire. The documents indicate that the cell was carrying enough explosives to level a residential building in Beersheba. This was the silent victory of the barrier, a catastrophe averted by the quote 40 of the fence, recorded only in a classified folder and the quiet sighs of the officers who closed the case. As the years passed, the barrier became a canvas for the quote 41 In the archives of the Ministry of Science and Technology, there are records of experiments conducted along the seam line. Israel was developing what would later become the world's most advanced border security exports. They were testing autonomous patrol vehicles and AI-driven threat detection systems that could distinguish between a stray animal and a human intruder with 99% accuracy. The fence was no longer just a physical shield. It was a laboratory for the defense of the 21st century. The Israeli side had realized that in a world of asymmetric warfare, the only way to protect a democracy was to outthink the enemy. The personal accounts of those working in the civil administration offer a glimpse into the humanitarian complexity that the quote 42 label ignores. Sarah, a young officer whose job was to coordinate medical permits, kept a personal diary that eventually found its way into a collection of testimonies at the National Library. She wrote of the quote 43 a specific section of the barrier where Palestinian children with chronic illnesses were met by Israeli ambulances. The logs of the crossing show that even during periods of high alert, the medical quote 44 remained open. Sarah described the surreal experience of standing between a concrete wall designed to stop snipers and an ambulance door opening to save a life. This duality is etched into the very stones of the barrier. The archives of the Ministry of Justice contain hundreds of rulings from the Israeli Supreme Court, each one a testament to the nation's internal struggle. One file from 2009 concerns a petition regarding an ancient olive grove in the Galilee. The documents show that the Ministry of Defense was ordered to relocate a 3-kilometer section of the fence at a cost of 12 million shekels to ensure the trees remained accessible to their owners. The apartheid myth suggests a state of total disregard, but the legal archives suggest a state obsessed with the proportionality of its actions. By the turn of the decade, the barrier had become part of the landscape, a silent guardian that many Israelis had begun to take for granted. The documents from the Ministry of Tourism show that in areas where the fence had replaced the threat of gunfire, new parks and hiking trails were being developed. The Jerusalem envelope, a section of the barrier that protected the capital, allowed for the revitalization of neighborhoods that had previously been in the line of fire. The concrete slabs in places like Gilo were now covered in greenery, blending into the urban environment, their original purpose to stop the bullets of the Second Intifada, half forgotten by the younger generation. However, the archives also reveal the dark side of the Palestinian Authority's response to the barrier's success. As the suicide bombings became nearly impossible to execute, The documents of the Israeli Intelligence Corps show a shift in tactics. The funding that had once gone to martyrs began to flow into the development of unguided rockets and mortars. The fence, it seemed, had forced the conflict into the air. The Iron Dome was born from the same logic as the barrier, an intellectual shield to protect civilians from an enemy that refused to stop targeting them. The barrier had won the ground war, and now the battle was moving to the skies. In the secret archives of the Prime Minister's office, there is a fascinating series of exchanges from 2012 regarding the propaganda front. The Israeli leadership realized that the Apartheid Wall label was being used as a strategic weapon in the halls of the United Nations. One memorandum suggested that the barrier's very success was its biggest public relations weakness. Because it was so effective at stopping terror, the world had forgotten why it was built in the first place. Without the daily horror of bus bombings, the barrier looked like an act of aggression rather than an act of defense. The documents reflect a sense of frustration, a nation being condemned for the very act of successfully protecting its citizens. The logistical records of the mid-2000s and 10s show a continuous effort to, quote, 52 the barrier. Millions were spent on landscaping, on improving the aesthetic of the crossings, and on increasing the number of work permits. The archives of the Bank of Israel show that the Palestinian economy in the West Bank actually grew significantly during the years the barrier was most active. The security provided by the fence allowed for a stable environment where businesses could finally operate without the constant threat of military incursions into city centers. The fence, in a strange irony, had created the quote, 53 necessary for economic life to flourish. Yet there were always the rumors of what lay beneath. In the border towns of the Galilee and the quote, 54 local residents whispered about sounds coming from the earth. The archives of the IDF's Northern Command from 2014 contain early reports of what would eventually become the quote, 55 operation. The enemy, finding the fence and the Iron Dome insurmountable, had begun to dig. This was the next evolution of the threat, a subterranean war. The response from the Israeli side was once again intellectual. They began to develop, quote, 56A technological barrier that reached deep into the bedrock. The story of the barrier is the story of a nation that refuses to be a victim. It is a story told in the language of engineering, law, and survival. To the 45-year-old Israeli father, the barrier is the reason his children can ride the bus. To the world, it is a quote, 57 But the documents, the real physical papers in the archives, do not lie. They show a 97% wire fence built in response to a wave of slaughter. They show a 3% concrete wall built to stop snipers from killing infants in their beds. They show a state that used its intellect to find a way to live in a neighborhood that sought its destruction. In the final folders of the 2020s, the barrier is described not as a permanent border, but as a, quote, 58 that remains subject to the political realities of the future. The documents show that the Israeli government remains ready to dismantle or move the barrier if a true, lasting peace is ever achieved. But until that day, the __59__ remains. The archives of the Ministry of Defense conclude with a reflection on the cost of the project, not just the billions of shekels, but the psychological toll of living behind a fence. The consensus among the leadership, however, remains unshakable. The price of the barrier is high, but the price of its absence would be paid in blood. The legacy of the barrier is a testament to the __60__. It is a model for how democracy can defend its borders in an age of terror using technology rather than total war. The lessons learned in the __61__ are now being studied by nations across the globe. The archives of Israel's military exports show that the __62__ technology is now protecting borders in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. What began as a desperate attempt to stop suicide bombers has become a global standard for sophisticated border security. Israel did not just build a fence, it built an intellectual paradigm for the modern age. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hills of Judea, the barrier stands as a silent witness to a generation's struggle. The wire hums with the data of 1,000 sensors, an invisible web of protection that keeps the peace of the night. In the archives of the future, historians will look back at this structure and see it for what it truly was. Not a monument to separation, but a fortress of the mind. They will see the maps, the court rulings, and the blueprints, and they will realize that the, '63 was the greatest myth of the 21st century, constructed by those who could not or would not see the reality of the threat. There is a final, peculiar entry in a diary found in the personal papers of a retired general who was instrumental in the barrier's early design. He mentions a meeting in 2015 with a foreign diplomat who asked him if he ever felt guilty about the wall. The general's response was not recorded in the official minutes, but he wrote it in the margin of his notebook. He said that every time he sees a family walking safely through the streets of Tel Aviv, the weight of the __64__ feels lighter than air. He understood that the true barrier was the hatred on the other side. And until that was dismantled, the wire and the concrete would remain the most moral choice a nation could make. Deep within the classified sections of the Curia, there is a map that is never shown to the public. It is a map of what comes after the barrier. It shows a series of __65__, where the physical fence has been replaced entirely by high-frequency pulses and satellite-linked detection. The rumors suggest that this __66__ is already being implemented in the most sensitive areas. It is the ultimate goal of the intellectual defense, a border that exists only in the digital realm, yet is more impenetrable than any stone. This, '67, is the final answer to the, '68 myth, a wall that isn't even there, yet ensures that not a single life is lost to the shadows. The truth about the security fence remains buried in the thousands of folders of the Israel State Archives, waiting for those with the patience to read the data. It is a truth of cold logic and warm hearts, of a people who chose to build a shield rather than a sword. As the lights of the Galgalim crossings flicker on for the night shift, the barrier continues its silent work. It is said that in the quietest hours of the night, if you stand near the wire in the Arava, you can hear a faint, rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of a nation that has learned to protect itself with every fiber of its intellect. Some say it is just the wind in the mesh, but those who know the history understand it is the sound of a future being secured. The final document in the folder is a simple photograph, unmarked and undated. It shows an Israeli child and a Palestinian child, separated by the fence, but both safely reaching through the mesh to share a piece of fruit. It is an image that was never released to the media, for it contradicts every narrative of hate. The photo was found in the desk of a security official who had spent his career maintaining the barrier. He had kept it as a reminder that the fence was never meant to be a wall between hearts, but a shield against those who would stop such a moment from ever happening. The photo sits in the archive now, a silent, powerful rebuke to the slogans of the world.